Hey, YouTube, how is it going? I hope all is well. I want to apologize right off the bat. It has been a long while since I've made any content whatsoever. Couple of reasons for that. Reason number one, I started a new career, as some of you may know, and I needed to pour into that a little bit more. Our company is starting to roll out Dynamics 365, which is kind of a big deal. So I just needed to focus in on that a little bit. And unfortunately, making these videos is kind of work for me. It's not just something I go out and spend like 5-10 minutes a day. It's work. So doing like a 30-minute video is still a couple hours worth of my time. And I needed to focus. So enough with the excuses, though. I definitely want to say thank you to everybody. All the love and the support is amazing. I never thought in a million years that I would garner any kind of attention to the likes of which I have. It's just crazy to me that people are even interested in this kind of content at all. I feel that it's a little boring and not very interactive. I promise I'm going to try to get better at that kind of stuff. I'm at a point now where I think I can start to balance work and, doing content like this as well. So, just a big thank you to all of you that have, subscribed. I hope you like this kind of stuff, and, I hope you continue to watch this kind of stuff. So thank you. Let's talk a little bit more about this project. You may have already noticed that the sound of the recording is a little bit different. I am in a friend of mine's living area, and you may hear a bird every now and then chirp and squawk and whatnot, and otherwise tease and prompt, or taunt me, if you will. I am house sitting at the moment. I'm babysitting some fur babies, and there's a little bit of a story behind that. There's a reason I'm telling you that. So first and foremost, obviously you can see we're talking about a Champion 600. Now, the owner of the house in which I'm babysitting at right now, a couple weeks ago, he hit me up. He said, "Hey, I've got this, Champion 600. I would love to turn it into a point-to-point amp and modify it a little bit. Take it home with you and do whatever you will with it. Just do what you want. I want to turn it into a rock and roll amp." So I was like, "Sure, we got you." Now, why is that significant as to why this thing is called Champers? Well, one of his fur babies is called Champ, and this is a Champ-based amp, so I call Champ Champers. Hey, Champers. I'm looking at him right now. So I call him Champers, and what a perfect way to, name an amp that we're going to modify that is Champ-based and name it after his dog and, get something out of it. So there's that. As you can see here, I'm using my favorite Schemit. It is offered by DigiKey. It is free. It is an online-only software, which is unfortunate, but that is okay. I highly suggest you go and check it out. It's great if you want to build this kind of stuff. I've talked about it in other videos before, but you can never go wrong with this. It's always helpful to build a schematic, even if you don't need it. It's just a great learning tool, and it really just kind of helps you chronologue things too, if you will. So in either case, you can see I've kind of gotten the bones kind of built here. I am not going to have you watch me actually do this in real time. We'll do a sped up video of me building this out with some background music and stuff like that, and then, yada, yada, yada. So we don't have to deal with that kind of crap. But let's talk a little bit about, the pros and the cons and what makes this amp cool and a little bit different than perhaps the actual Champ, that we're all, the 5F1 that we all kind of think about when we think of Champ. First and foremost, let's get it out there that this is meant to be an affordable, inexpensive, beginner amplifier. I think at the time it was offered, it was like $200 or $300 or something like that. I think they quit making this thing in like 2011, 2012, perhaps. I could be wrong, but so there's that. But there's a couple things they did differently. I don't know the exact history of the Champion 600 and all that jazz. I don't know if it had a tone stack in it or not, yada, 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 whatever. I know that they called the Champ initially the Champion 600. Like in the late 1940s when they first built these amps, it was called the Champion 600, and then they had the Champion 800 or whatever. But so there's a lot of similarities to the 5F1, which is what, we kind of assume as being the Champ. That's definitely one of the plus sides to this amp. I mean, it's good enough for, well, maybe not this amp in general, but the Champ is good enough for the likes of Eric Clapton and Neil Young. I mean, some of them made their entire lives off of this amp. So just know that it's got good bones in it, if you will. So let's talk about some of the things that definitely make it not as desirable, though. One of the things that's kind of a bummer is the way that they had to lay things out. They've got these extra grid stoppers on each of the tubes. Now, the reason they had to do that is to make sure that Radio Disney doesn't get picked up and amplified out of the amplifier. Makes sense. Obviously, we don't want Radio Disney playing out while we're trying to do, some Led Zeppelin or something like that, right? But that is one of the downsides to, having a ribbon cable go between the front of the amp and the middle of the amp with the signal going back and forth at least 2 or 3 times, right? So why is that significant? Why do I point that out? In the original, there is nothing like that. These guys here are right off the pins, and that's the way it should be. And it does change the sound of the amp a little bit. 10K doesn't seem like it's that much, but it does make a difference. So there's that. Now, the biggest thing that I think is a downer in this amp is this guy right here, the tone stack. If you've ever seen a circuit for a Fender Marshall Vox treble middle bass tone stack, this is what it will look like. Now, the only difference is instead of using potentiometers or variable resistors in there, they used fixed value resistors that baked in the EQ curve that they wanted to have for this amplifier. Whether you want it or not, that's what you get. You can modify things, but as you can see, it's quite the network, and it's not exactly easy to just go in there and change one little thing and, like the result and have the result that you want, right? So this has got to go. So in the new, when we rebuild this amp, it's going to have a more standard Champ style, 5F1 style, coupling cap with a dropping resistor or something like that and a volume knob. So this has to go. This is definitely a big downer for it. I'm not really going to get into the tone stack that much. You can read up on that. Get the Duncan tone stack calculator. Definitely worth the investment. You can see what all these values do and how it changes the sound of the amp, right? The gain stages themselves are pretty much normal. They're Fender and, the million other amps out there. It's the same kind of value as those. It's got a 100K plate resistor, 1.5K cathode resistor, and it's fully bypassed on both stages with a 22 UF bypass capacitor. So full range amplification in both of these stages. That's par for the course. The unfortunate thing is, these tone stacks are very, very lossy, which means that it's really not spanking this next gain stage as much as it could be. So if you were to eliminate this guy altogether and just use a standard 5F1 type circuit, this guy would be getting hit a lot harder. And you might like that more, you may not. I don't know. We'll play with that later on when we get to that point. But let's take a quick little drink break. It is time to take a sip of my beer. So give me just 1 second here. As is always suggested for designing and building guitar amplifiers, it is generally a good idea to have a beer or a beverage of your choice within arm's reach at all times. But as Thomas Sinclair has said, always in moderation. So let's move on. Okay, so 0.022, that's the value of the coupling capacitor that they use between the preamp and the power tube, or the power amp section of the amp, if you will. 0.022, I've mentioned this before in other videos. I think that's like the magic number for any position in the amp. If you're not sure what value you want to go with, start there. 0.022 is like the middle ground, if you will. If you need more bass, you go higher in value, so 0.047 or 0.1. If you need less bass, you go smaller, so 0.1 or 0.0047, right? I think in this amp, 0.022 is probably a perfect number. You can do more work in this area if you wanted to. So they nailed it here, I believe. That is a me thing. Other people might feel different. That's okay. But let's talk a little bit more about balance. So when I refer to balance, I'm talking about what distorts when and, where in the amp. In amps like this, where there's a low number of gain stages and you're relying heavily on the output section. There are some that believe that the power tube is the first thing that should distort. I kind of don't feel that way. And when I say first thing that should distort, I think that they mean generally speaking, that it distorts obviously and apparently long before or well before any of these other stages start to distort. That's what I'm referring to in that regard. Now, this is an opinion. This is not gospel. I'm just talking about a possibility here. This is a balancing act. So output tube distortion, I don't think is as desirable as most people think it is. They think they like it, but the reason that they think they like it is because by the time they start hearing this guy distort, generally there's other stages in the amp that are already distorting as well, which means that there's some amount of interaction between the preamp and the power amp section of the amp. So I prefer a more balanced approach. If this guy is distorting, I want this guy to be distorting pretty much, right after it, if not right after it, at about the same time as it. That is why my 18 watt has a volume control on both sides of the phase inverter. So I have a master volume over here, and I've got a gain over here. So most of the distortion that you hear in my 18 watt design is really coming from the pi. But you can balance, because I've left it with a little bit of room, you can get the output section to distort first. It's not significant, but you can get it to distort first. And then, of course, the pi is obviously going to start distorting. But the majority of the distortion that you do get is coming from the pi. And then it cascades into the output section. And when you combine those two, you get this glorious harmonic crunch and growl, and it sounds, like a rock machine, really. So you can play with that. And where you play with that in this particular amp is right here with the grid leak going to the power tube. 220, I think they kind of nailed it there. That's a good all-around value in any amp of any design to start with. If you're not sure where to go, start with 220. 100K is probably the lowest value you can get away with. So I wouldn't try going with a value lower than 100K. And 470 to even 1 meg, 470 is probably the upper end of where you're going to want to go, but you can go as high as 1 meg. But obviously the higher in value you go, the more it's going to make the power tube work. That means the sooner this will distort. So playing with this value here, you can balance where the distortion in the amp is coming from and at what point in time in the gain, or the amount of gain that you apply, it's coming in at. So balancing act. It's literally what it is. All right. Let's talk about a couple other weaknesses and a couple other things that could have been done better, but it's, again, some of it's opinion, some of it's real truth. They had to go with this. So in one of the ways in order to reduce the cost of the amp, they went with a power transformer that doesn't have center taps. That is totally fine. It is a nice way to make the power transformer much, much cheaper. For this particular amp, I wish they would have gone with the center tap. It's a little bit quieter that way. You still can use a full wave rectifier. It won't be a full wave bridge rectifier, but it'll be a full wave. So you still get a lot of the benefits of a bridge rectifier without some of the downsides. It's always a balancing act, right? It's cheaper to throw in a couple other, a couple 2-cent parts than it is to wrap a couple extra feet of copper into something. So in this case, they went with a full wave bridge rectifier, and to help reduce the amount of HT noise, or the ripple and noise that you hear on the HT line, they went with capacitors over each of those diodes. It adds complexity. It looks a mess on a schematic, and it doesn't look any better in the amp. That is a personal opinion. This is just fine the way it is. It works. That's great. The bean counters at Fender, of course, had to go, well, can we save 2 cents on, or $1 building this amp? Yes. Great. We're going to do it that way then. And that's one of the ways that they did it. So instead of wrapping some extra, wire in here, they went with, 2-cent parts wrapped around this thing. Whatever. That's great. Now, an area where it probably doesn't matter that there is a center tap or not is the heater supply. The heater supply is the highest current power supply in the amp. There's somewhere between 2 to 5 amps worth of current capability in this section here. So most of the noise that you're going to hear in an amplifier build is going to come from the heater. So having an artificial center tapped heater supply is actually quite the good thing. Couple reasons why. One is you can reference it to ground in a couple different ways. You can still do it the same way with a center tapped one, but it's just a little bit easier when you have to create an artificial center tap. So in this case here, you take these two 100 ohm resistors and you tie them together with a connection to ground. Now in this case, we're going to call that relative ground. It's connected to actual ground here, right? But the reason we're going to call it relative ground is because you could also attach it here at this point, the socket of pin 8 on the output tube. Now, why does it matter? You'll notice here at this point, which is on the other side of this cathode bias resistor, that we have plus 22 volts DC sitting on the cathode of this output tube. So that means that the heater supply, or the heaters that actually heat that cathode, are there's a 22 volt difference between them. Now you have the heaters are what actually heat up the cathode. So the cathode is what boils off the electrons to flow towards the plate. So they're in very close proximity to each other, the heaters and the cathode. So now you have the noisiest thing in the amp, the heaters, sitting right next to the cathode, and there's a 22 volt difference between them. That is not exactly the best way to do things. Had they just taken this guy right here, and instead of running it to ground, they ran the wire or PCB trace right up to the cathode, the pin 8 socket of the cathode of that tube, it would have reduced the heater noise a significant amount, and maybe not significant, but a noticeable amount, a measurable amount of noise difference. And it would be because instead of having a 22 volt difference between the heater and the cathode, now there would be a 0 volt difference between the heater and the cathode. So that helps reduce noise significantly. But that's the beauty of having an artificial center tapped, heater supply, is you can choose to do it from ground, or you can choose to do it from the cathode, and whichever one produces the least noise, you're fine. Another upside to having an artificial center tapped heater supply is that these two little guys here, they're 100 ohm resistors, they act like a fuse. So if angry pixies inside of either of these tubes decides they want to get from the HT to the heaters, which would be ungood, the angry pixies are going to places they shan't be, these guys here are going to burn out in very short order, which may potentially save your power transformer from also burning up. Now, in this case, they did fuse the HT supply. That is a good thing. That is actually good practice to do. I don't necessarily think it's necessary. It's a lot of work and a lot of extra parts for a part that really isn't significantly that expensive, not prohibitively expensive, that's for sure. This power transformer here might be, I don't know, $50 tops, maybe $60 on the high end. It's not that expensive. It's less than $100 for sure. For some people, $100 might be expensive, but when you think about most bench charges these days, just to look at the amp, this is an insignificant cost. So when it costs an extra $100 to build the circuitry around protecting this guy, there's that balancing act. Do you really need it? Especially since, in this case, there are essentially 3 fuses to protect this power transformer from burning up. In the rare case, and I mean rare, it is very rare for the tube to self-destruct in such a way where it starts arcing to the heater supply and taking out the heater, portion of the power transformer. Mostly opinion there, but there is some truth to that. Take it as you will. It's always a good idea to put a fuse in there. And even in the HT supply, it's not a bad idea to put a fuse. But again, when you need it, you need it. When you don't, you don't. And in this amp, I don't think you need it. Those guys right there are going to do the dirty work for you. So there you have it. That is kind of the rough go around of this guy, what you can change, what's where, and all that jazz. So we're gonna kind of go into this. Like I said, I'm not gonna have you watch me do it in real time. You'll just see a sped up version of it with some background music. But we'll come back to this, or I'll talk to you more here in a bit. But thank you so much for sticking with me so far, and we'll talk to you here in a few. Hey, all right, here we are. Okay, so this is just a rough, down and dirty kind of, I got it done. I'm going to tell you right now, these kind of things where you see schematics like this that look like they were done by somebody like me, these are definitely caveat emptor. So don't just take it as gospel, run with it. There might be mistakes. There's some oddities in here. I didn't bother trying to fix this little section right here. That extra dot that's right there where my little pointer's at, that's not supposed to be there. These are all supposed to just be one, and it was just one of those things. I didn't bother like moving everything up and then trying to, whatever, it is what it is. I wanted to get it done. I got it done. I didn't draw in the heater circuit, so I didn't put the artificial center tap drawn off of the pin 8 of the tube. I didn't label the tubes. I didn't call them what they were. So I kept it pretty simple. I drew it out like I like to draw things. I like going from left to right for everything. And I prefer using labeling the nodes, if you will. So A, B, C, and then you got A, B, and C. I like doing it that way just because you're able to box everything into a smaller spot. It's just cleaner. And for me, I just want things to be clean and concise, with this little, what I call cabbage in the way, cabbage being garbage. So I just want to try to minimize the garbage. Like if I were really trying to go serious, I probably would have just moved this all up. So this could have been straight out right here, but I'd already kind of had everything in this plane, if you will. So, even myself right now, I'm kind of anal about it. I want to move it down one. So, those little types of things like that are just the differences and the intricacies of schematics. And Tootie she wants attention. She just really wants attention. So building schematics is kind of like it's a language, obviously, but you know, like anybody that speaks with words, they have kind of their own little lingo, their own little cadence, their own little idioms, and their own little thing about them that makes their language unique to someone else's. If I write a book about, you know, why the sky is blue, it's going to be different than the next guy's book that is about why the sky is blue. Same thing goes for schematics. So that's why you always have to check and make sure that the schematic is correct before you just go out and build it and turn the thing on. It may not be right. So there, we've got that out of the way. So now we're at the point here where we're gonna start gutting the other amp and building it and whatnot. I'm gonna try to do this into a 3-part series. So this one here, we kind of see what we're gonna work with. And in the next series, we'll see, you know, we'll gut it and then we'll rebuild it. And then probably in the third series, you know, the third part of the series, we'll do like a little sound sample and stuff like that. I kind of have another treat on the way. I already have a 5-watt amp. You saw some of the videos on that 5-watt combo amp that I built. I'm thinking I might do like a comparison of the two, so you can kind of get an idea of what the difference or lack of difference is between a 6v6 style amp with cascaded gain stages. And I say cascaded because you got this here rolling into this guy here, whereas the other amp that I built, it's a parallel, you know, 12AX7 that goes straight into an EL84. So two totally different ideals with kind of the same basic bones to turn it into what it is. So that'll be kind of cool, I think, to kind of show the two differences and or similarities between them. So thank you so much. We'll see you in the next video, and take care. Bye-bye.